and check it on monitor. This is Florentine Films, American Documentaries, The Civil War, Sound Roll 1, Picture Roll 1. It's April 17, 1986. An interview with Shelby Foote.
Speed, it's up to the first record, not unlimited, right?
Oh, it doesn't matter. Send it up to limited. All the way.
No limited.
Okay, we got speed and power. And
Okay.
I'm ready. I'll come in at the end of your question.
It's hard to really know exactly where to begin, but I think maybe why did Americans kill each other in such extraordinary numbers for 4 years?
It was because we failed to do the thing we really have a genius for, which is compromise. Americans like to think of themselves as uncompromising. Our true genius is for compromise. Our whole government's founded on it, and it failed.
That's why the Civil War happened.
Yes, of course, for many reasons, but basically it was a failure on our part to find a way not to fight that war.
We'd had a half century of uneasy alliances and compromises. Why did this beautiful country break down?
There's so many reasons that can be assigned after the fact, slavery being the main one, and that's Lincoln's identification of the central problem. It was also the fire eaters of the South. It was a great distress on the part of the South since they saw the changes that they didn't welcome in the government. For example, there had always been Southern presidents up until a point where they stopped being Southern presidents. They weren't too happy about that. The other thing, and a really important one historically, is when they entered into that federation, they certainly would never have entered into it if they hadn't believed it would be possible to get out. And when the time came that they wanted to get out, they thought they had every right. Secession wasn't strictly a Southern thing either. Massachusetts threatened to secede long before any Southern state did. Of course, they say wars never settle anything. That business about secession was certainly settled by that war.
What makes the war important today?
As a Southerner, I would say one of the main importances of the war is that Southerners have a sense of defeat, which none of the rest of the country has. You'll see in the movie Patton, the actor who plays Patton saying, "We Americans have never lost a war." That's a rather amazing statement for him to make as Patton, because Patton's grandfather was in Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, and he certainly lost a war.
The war is really, what you're saying is the war is really with us.
It is with us in the sense of tragic defeat and Reconstruction which followed. There was far from a Marshall Plan. There was the opposite of a Marshall Plan.
We know the South was fighting for, among other things, slavery, defense of slavery. Actually, I think what I'm going to do is...
Wait. Slate. Once more. Good.
2 slates. Was the South fighting for something worthwhile? I mean, we think of this issue of slavery, and obviously there's nothing... We know they're fighting for slavery. Is there something to commend why the South went to battle?
The South Southerners would have told you they were fighting for self-government. They believed that the gathering of power in Washington was against them. They were opposed to any number of small things, such as high tariffs, which made their farm implements cost more. A lot of things.
Bruce Catton said that it was that slavery was the poison that convulsed the nation finally into war.
I do not really believe that, except as an issue which people who wanted to exploit it could grab hold of. I'm not defending slavery as a good thing, but as for cause of the war, it was simply almost a propaganda item. Slavery was certainly doomed to extinction. There's no doubt about how long it would have lasted. It was certainly profitable. It wasn't going to disappear because it wasn't profitable. It was. But slavery had been abolished all over the place. The serfs were freed in 1861 in Russia, and it was down the road and not far down the road. Some plan of compensated emancipation would certainly have worked in time.
Catton again also said that America at the beginning of the war was small enough to carry in the heart and in the mind. What was America like? What was the America that went to war in 1861?
It had a simplicity that we are not able to comprehend. Of course, that's true anytime you get something in the past. If you see a 1930s movie now, the simplicity of the thing is just amazing. So that when you subtract 70-odd years from that, you get back to another kind of simplicity. But as Lincoln said, human nature doesn't change, and human nature didn't change, but men's beliefs had a startling simplicity to it. For example, a soldier in line at Gettysburg told, "You will advance a mile across that open valley and take that hill." I, for one, would say, "General, I don't think we should do this. I don't believe we can get there." But they took it in a matter of course. And you must remember they fought for 4 years, which is a long time, and this simplicity was severely tested, but they never lost it. Duty, bravery under adversity, very simple virtues, and they had them.
Well, drink in the country for me for a second, visually, geographically. Just before the war started, we're poised at the edge of war. What was the kind of country I was seeing?
Well, for one thing, you'd have to realize to what a great extent it was agricultural. The farmers were the largest single body of people, and that had its influence. Schools were different. They taught very simple subjects, and all the teachers were men, incidentally. Very few women teachers, but until after the Civil War. Incidentally, one of the great changes the Civil War made was a women teacher. It gave employment to the old maids and the widows from the Civil War. To define it as a country is not easy because it's so far from us, and yet we still have many of the qualities that those people had. They were Americans then as they are now. We were not as diverse. For example, in 20 years of researching the Civil War, I came across maybe 2 Italian names. Lots of Germans and Hungarians, but no Italians at all.
But tell me what then America was like in 1865. How had it changed, just even in its bones?
It really is one of those watershed things. It was a huge chasm between the beginning and the end of the war. The nation had come face to face with a dreadful tragedy, and we reacted the way a family would do with a dreadful tragedy. It was almost inconceivable that anything that horrendous could happen. You must remember that casualties in Civil War battles were so far beyond anything we can imagine now. If we had 10% casualties in a battle today, it would be looked on as a bloodbath. They had 30% in several battles, and one after another, you see. Shiloh had the same percentage of casualties as Waterloo.
Hold on, please. We'll do a slate. Camera, please.
Slate?
Head slate. The horror and the killing of the Civil War, we tend to romanticize, and we forget that this was an extraordinarily bloody event. I mean, remind me of that.
Well, figures sometimes do it. I said Shiloh had the same percentage of casualties as Waterloo, and yet when it was fought, there were another 20 Waterloos to follow. And you just cannot conceive there were 1 million casualties, for instance, in the Civil War. Over 1 million casualties, including the wounded and captured, as well as the killed, and those who died of various diseases at the same time. And it's hard for us to conceive. A good example of how bloody it was is that in the year after the war, the state of Mississippi spent 1/5 of its total income on artificial arms and legs for veterans back from the war. That's an incredible figure.
Why is it that we romanticize it? I mean, this was us. We killed not some foreign enemy, we killed ourselves.
That's very much in character. We think that we are a wholly superior people. If we'd been anything like as superior as we think we are, we would not have fought that war. But since we did fight it, we have to make it the greatest war of all times. And our generals were the greatest generals of all time. It's very American to do that. And we did it with that war as we have with all other wars we fought.
But we did murder each other.
You did indeed. It was brutal stuff. The reason for the high casualties is really quite simple. The weapons were way ahead of the tactics. The rifle itself, it threw a .53 caliber soft lead bullet at a low muzzle velocity. And when it hit, the reason there were so many amputations, if you got hit here, it didn't clip your bone the way the modern steel jacketed bullet does. You didn't have any bone from here to here. They had no choice but to take the arm off. And you'll see pictures of the dead on the battlefield with their clothes in disarray as if someone had been going rifling their bodies. That was the men themselves tearing their clothes up to see where the wound was. And they knew perfectly well if they were gut shot, they'd die. It was they still believed that to take a position you massed your men and moved up and gave them the bayonet. Well, there were practically no bayonet wounds in the Civil War, much more than there were in the First World War or the Second. They never came in that kind of contact, or at least very seldom came in that kind of contact. But they still thought that to mass their fire, they had to mass their men. So they lined up and marched up toward an entrenched line and got blown away. And they didn't advance by rushes. They lined up. They believed that if you didn't line up, you weren't formidable. The other side wasn't as apt to run from you. If you lined up and marched steadily toward them, they would run. But of course what happened to them is they shot you.
Thank you. We've just run out of film in this roll. End of roll. That's great. It'll take us a few minutes to change rolls,
Sure.
and then we'll do it. Go beep, beep. Roll 2, sound roll 2, Shelby Foote interview continuing. But there are more examples of the horror of the war, which we always tend to forget.
The very figures are a stark statement of it, but they are interesting. At Pickett's charge, the casualties were almost exactly 50% of the men who took part in that charge. That includes the captured as well as the killed and wounded. On the first day at Shiloh, the 6th Mississippi, as part of Pat Claiborne's brigade, made 4 separate charges against a ridge where Sherman's headquarters were, and they took it on the 4th charge. But they went into that charge with 425 men and came out with just over 100, to show you extreme examples of the carnage that's involved. There again, you have this massing of men against rifled guns. It's horrendous.
If you could be that proverbial fly on the wall in history, observing an event or events, if you can't decide one, where would you like to have been? Where could you be plopped down to watch?
Oh, I suppose in the living room of the McLean house at Appomattox would be an obvious good place to be. I wouldn't mind being at the Gettysburg Address. I would like to just see Lee on his horse in battle. So many things I'd like to see.
Tell me why on the McLean house. Maybe start again and saying if you could be in one.
That's where it ended, you see, at the McLean house. And it would be great to see Lee and Grant in the same room there together and see the contrast between the two men. And by no means all the admiration would go to Lee. Grant's conduct at Appomattox was totally admirable. The best side of Grant came out at that time, and I would like to see that.
Any other event you'd love to be down there, and why?
I scarcely know of an event in the whole war I wouldn't like to have seen. I would like to have seen the Battle of Memphis here, the naval battle, which was a complete fiasco that just blew the Confederates out of the water. But I would like to have seen it. It's hard to know. I would like, you have people you become very fond of in writing about. There's an Arkansas general who's nearly been forgotten now. At the time, he was sometimes called the Stonewall Jackson of the West. His name was Pat Claiborne. He was a great general, probably the best division commander in either army. And I would just like to see Pat Claiborne sitting in a chair somewhere. I would get a terrific kick out of that.
Besides Claiborne, what figure are you drawn to, or figures in the war and the whole thing that would you just not so much like to know, but who is the figure?
It's a funny thing. A writer has use for villains as he does for heroes. I would love to see Stanton in action. He was a bully and a coward and all kinds of bad things, but he livens up page after page of history, and I would love to see him in action. It's a curious thing. It's like I suspect Dickens was very fond of Bill Sykes. Same kind of thing.
Do you have a favorite story about the war?
There's so many of them. One of my favorites, you ask what's the cause of the war. Early in the war, a Union squad closed in on a single ragged Confederate, and he obviously didn't own any slaves. He couldn't have much interest in the Constitution or anything else. He said, "What are you fighting for anyhow?" They asked him, and he said, "I'm fighting because you're down here," which was a pretty satisfactory answer.
I find amidst all this incredible drama, great humor in the war.
Always. There's so many ridiculous stories about the war. There's no end to them. And there's scarcely a page of the Civil War, as I see it, that doesn't have something maybe not funny, but certainly sardonic or akin to humor in some kind of way. There are many stories about that.
It seems full of grim irony, as if there maybe were only 200 people in the entire country, because everything seemed to be happening to somebody's relative, aunt, brother,
Right.
sister, on both sides.
There were any number of stories. Lincoln had, my God, an inexhaustible fund of stories. My favorite story that Lincoln told was he described a Union general out in front of his troops on horseback, and they were having a review, and the horse got to kicking and prancing and jerking around. And somehow or another, the horse got his rear foot hooked in the stirrup. And the general looked down at this ridiculous situation and said to the horse, "If you're going to get on, I'll get off." It's ridiculous. Fairly typical Lincoln humor, incidentally. He had a funny, sardonic turn of mind about funny stories. And he could always tie them in to make a point with them.
What kind of man was he?
A very mysterious man. He's got so many sides to him. The curious thing about Lincoln to me is that he could remove himself from himself as if he were looking at himself. It's a very strange, very eerie thing, and highly intelligent. That's a simple thing to say, but Lincoln's been so smothered with stories of his compassion that people forget what a highly intelligent man he was. And almost everything he did was calculated for effect. He knew exactly how to do it.
And he was a good writer.
Lincoln's literary ability is, he's knocking at the door of Mark Twain. He's a very great writer. The best example I know of what a great writer is that when I was in the schools as a child in Mississippi, I was required to memorize the Gettysburg Address. The Gettysburg Address says that if the South won the war, government of, by, and for the people would perish from the earth. What it said didn't have anything to do with whether or not I was required to memorize it. It was literary skill that made me memorize it. And he demonstrated it time after time again, even in incidental notes, which he wrote that he thought no one would ever see. His literary skill is almost unbelievable. The December 1862 State of the Union message to Congress is one of the great pieces of American writing, especially the peroration. He knew what he was doing. We didn't recognize that on this side of the water. It was the English who recognized him as a stylist first. Many Americans were ashamed of his style, which someone said had to bark on. He wrote American, and they thought American was a language, all right, and it could be used for vaudeville skits or jokes, but it didn't think it belonged in state papers. And what Lincoln wrote was American, same kind of American that Mark Twain was to write later. He's a very great literary artist.
I'd like to do a slate, please.
Okay, keep rolling now.
Okay.
Lincoln's greatest skill, which we'll come to.
Hold on one second.
Hang on. Okay, let's.
Slate.
Okay. We're talked a little bit about Lincoln. I think the great neglected figure may in fact be Jefferson Davis in the whole war. Tell me about Davis.
I entered the writing of the war with many misconceptions about Davis that had been fostered by Southerners as well as Northerners, and perhaps more by Southerners. He's often described as a bloodless pedant, a man who filled all his time with small-time paperwork and never anything else, an icy cold man who had no friendliness in him. I found the opposite to be true in all those respects. Davis is an outgoing, friendly man, a great family man, loved his wife and children, infinite store of compassion. I forget the figures now about how many soldiers Lincoln had shot. Davis had a bare handful. And these misconceptions about Davis are so strange that it's as if a gigantic conspiracy was launched. It was partly launched by Southerners, who, having lost the war, did not want to blame it on their generals, so they blamed it on the politicians, and of course Davis was the chief politician. So it was the Southerners more than the Northerners who vilified Jefferson Davis. The Northerners wanted to hang him from a sour apple tree, but the Southerners really tore him down after the war.
How was he as a chief of state?
Lee said it best. He said, I don't think anyone could name anyone who could have done a better job than Davis did, and I personally don't know of anyone who could have done as good a job. That's from Robert E. Lee, which is pretty good authority. Yeah.
Jackson, Stonewall Jackson.
A very strange man, one of the authentic geniuses of the war. Genius is a strange quality. Bedford Forrest's granddaughter lived here in Memphis. She recently died, and I got to know her, and she even let me swing the General Saber around my head once, which was a great treat. And I had thought a long time, and I called her and said, I think that the war produced two authentic geniuses. One of them was your grandfather, and the other was Abraham Lincoln. And there was a silence at the other end of the phone. And she said, well, you know, in our family, we never thought much of Mr. Lincoln. She didn't like my coupling her grandfather with Abraham Lincoln all these years later. Southerners was very strange about that war.
Tell me about Jackson. Why is he a genius?
He had the strange combination of religious fanaticism and a glory in battle. He loved battle. His eyes would light up. They called him Old Blue Light because of the way his eyes would light up in battle. He was totally fearless, had no thought whatsoever of danger at any time when the battle was on. And he could define what he wanted to do. He said, once you get them running, you stay right on top of them, and that way a small force can defeat a large one every time. He knew perfectly well that a reputation for victory would roll and build, and it was just everything about him. He was not a strict disciplinarian. He would shoot men, but he didn't care how they were dressed, whether they saluted properly or any of that foolishness.
Stop, please. There was a run out. Perfect, because I'll look exactly at those ragtag men as you're saying that with the cameras out.
Yeah.
This and that, but that's precisely
This is
why we
Right.
a continuation of interview with Shelby Foote. Sound roll 3, picture roll 3. Okay, sound. Anything more you want to talk about Jackson? How we can remember?
He was a true eccentric. He believed that if he had pepper in his food, it would make his left leg ache. He would never mail a letter that would be in transit on a Sunday. He was a stricter observer of the Sabbath, and yet so many of his battles were fought on Sundays that the soldiers began to believe that he would fight on Sunday because the Lord would be even more with him. He had a strange quality of overlooking suffering. During one of the battles, he had a young courier, and Jackson looked around for him. He wasn't there, and he said, "Where is Lieutenant so-and-so?" And they said, "He was killed, General." Jackson said, "Very commendable, very commendable." And they put him out of his mind. He would send men stumbling into battle. where fury was, and have no concern about casualties at the moment. He would march men until they were spitting cotton and white-faced and fell out by the wayside. He wouldn't even stop to glance at one of them, kept going. At Sharpsburg, when there was a lull in the battle, and he looked out over the cornfield there where his own and enemy dead were lying so thick you could have walked across it without touching the ground. He was eating a peach at the time, and he said, God has been very kind to us this day. He's just unbelievable in his ability to not be affected by things. I've sometimes thought that one of the necessary equipments for a superb military man is to be a little stupid so that he won't get jangled. Strange. Not that he was stupid, he wasn't.
Just go like that. Just brush that. Very good. Now talk to me about Lee. Okay. Oh, right. Before you go into Lee, the loss, Chancellorsville. What happened?
What happened was Jackson got shot, for one thing. The real fault at Chancellorsville was the attack was staged so late in the day that they were not able to push it to the extent that Jackson had intended to, and he was even attempting to make a night attack, a very rare thing in the Civil War, because he knew that he hadn't finished up what he'd started to begin. But Chancellorsville, in many ways, is Lee's masterpiece. It's where the odds were longest. It's where he took the greatest risk in dividing his army in the presence of a superior enemy and kept the pressure on.
But at the cost of Jackson.
At the cost of Jackson, which Lee said was too great a cost to bear in any case, and it was. He said later, long after the war, if I had had Stonewall Jackson with me at Gettysburg, I would have won that battle. I don't believe that's true. I believe that the battle wouldn't have been fought at Gettysburg if he'd had Jackson, because they would have taken that position, and the Unions would have fallen back to Pipe Creek, where they were prepared to fight anyhow.
Let's talk about Lee. Talk about the man.
Lee is one of the most difficult people to talk about because he's been immortalized, or as they call him now, some people, the Marble Man. He's been dehumanized by the glory and the worship. He was a warm, outgoing man, always had time for any private soldier's complaint. Once a Northern soldier being marched to the rear as a prisoner complained to Lee in person that someone had taken his hat, and he said that man got it, and Lee made the man give him his hat back. He could he could show his kindness in so many ways. He was a true gentleman, which is an explanation for a lot of the things about Lee. He had very little humor, but he did have a sort of sense of the ridiculous, and he liked fun. He was having dinner one night, and he invited a young lieutenant from a messenger who'd come in to sit down and have it with him. And the young man didn't like the heavy cornbread. And Lee said, "Don't worry about that. It'll stay by you longer." He had that quality to him.
How could a man like Lee give up country for state?
He didn't give up country for state. He considered Virginia his country. He often spoke of Virginia as my country. He said, "How could I fight against my country?" Meaning Virginia. During the civil rights upheaval back in the 50s and 60s and on into the 70s, William Faulkner used to often say, "Leave me ground to stand on." You didn't leave Robert E. Lee any ground to stand on, and you had a lot of occasion for regretting it. When Lee had to choose between the nation and Virginia, there was never any doubt about what his choice would be. He went with his state, and he said, "I can't draw my sword against my native state," or as he often said, my country.
Is he the greatest general that's ever lived?
I don't know that he is. He is a very great general, and he's superb on both the offensive and the defensive. He took long chances, but he took them because he had to. If Grant had not had superior numbers, he might have taken chances as long as Lee took. The only way to win was with long chances, and it made him brilliant. But part of it came from the need for long chances. But he was wonderful. He said, he learned this from General Scott. He said, I bring the men together on the field, and what happens on the field is up to them. He didn't believe in getting down in there and saying, no, don't do that, do this. He stood back and watched it.
Could you compare this aristocrat with a shabby private coat Grant?
Yes, in some sense, Lee represented the best of the Cavalier tradition, and Grant represented pretty close to the worst of the Puritan tradition. And yet, when they're face to face in that Appomattox courthouse house, Grant looks mighty good. He looks as fine. He's muddy, mud spattered, and everything else, but he's at least as much a gentleman as Lee. That's Grant at his very best. A quality of Lee's that should be mentioned is probably his finest hour was after the repulse of Pickett's charge on the third day at Gettysburg. He walked out into the field, met the men retreating, and said, it is all my fault. And he told them that. He wrote to the government, to Jefferson Davis, and said it was all my fault. I asked more of men than should have been asked of them. This willingness to take blame is just so rare as to, it stands out enormously. And that's another quality to him. He had another side to him that people don't pay much attention to. He had a good way of dealing with incompetence. He sent them out of his army, usually to the Trans-Mississippi, but he did that. He was a good administrator, and that's not usually paid much attention to. He was a superb intelligence officer. He read Northern papers assiduously. He questioned prisoners on occasion. He knew how to put himself in another man's mind. He knew what Grant was going to do because he could make himself Grant for long enough to figure out what Grant would do in a situation. When they fired, 5 or 6 generals before they got to Grant, and by the time they let McClellan go, Lee said, I'm afraid they're going to keep making these changes until they get someone I don't understand.
Did they?
They never got anyone he didn't understand, but they finally got Grant, who knew how to whip him, and did.
So Grant beat the greatest general who's ever lived.
He did indeed. He did it with superior numbers and doggedness. Kept going. Moved by the left flank, moved by the left flank, moved by the left flank. And Lee's backing up the whole time, losing men that he couldn't replace.
How will we remember Grant? How should we remember Grant, the general?
Grant the general has many qualities, but he had a thing that's very necessary for a great general. He had what they call 4 o'clock in the morning courage. You could wake him up at 4 o'clock in the morning and tell him that they had just turned his right flank, and he would be as cool as a cucumber. He had an ability to concentrate. A good example of that is he would be working at his desk, bent over writing, and he would need something across the room, a document or something. He would get up and never get out of that crouched position, go over there and pick up the document he needed, come back to his desk and sit down again without ever having straightened up. It's an example of how he could concentrate.
What are some moments with Grant you'd like us to remember? Where do you picture him when you think of him?
It's because it's so unusual, but Grant in the wilderness, after that first night in the wilderness, went to his tent, broke down and cried very hard. Some of the staff members said they'd never seen a man so unstrung. But he didn't cry until the battle was over, and he wasn't crying when it began again next day. It just shows you the tension that he lived with that without letting it affect him. Right in the middle of the Battle of the Wilderness, all the staff men who had been fighting in the East all this time, and he had just come from the West, kept talking about Bobby Lee, he will do this and do that other. And Grant finally told him, I'm tired of hearing about Bobby Lee. You'd think he's going to do a double somersault and land in our rear. Quit thinking about what he's going to do to you and think about what you're going to do to him. Bring some guns up here. Things like that. Grant's, he's wonderful.
What about alcohol?
Grant never got drunk when his wife was around. It was only 2 conditions Grant would drink under. One was his wife wasn't there, and the other was there wasn't anything going on. He went on a true bender during the Vicksburg campaign, but it was when nothing was happening. It was as if he, whether there was anything sexual about his wife being out of touch, I'm not too sure about, but I do know that it was boredom that would make him drink. And there was no instance of his drinking during the last campaign against Lee.
This is a continuation of interview with Shelby Foote. Sound roll number 4, camera roll number 4.
I guess let's talk about Sherman, because in some ways he's the counterpart to Jackson in that he's the Union's great lieutenant. Talk about him.
Sherman was not much on a field of fight, but he was a superb strategist. He would set things up so that he was going to win no matter what happened on the field. And he was not really an inspired battlefield commander, but he was superb in organizing what he was about. Sherman, and Grant too, but Sherman is maybe the first truly modern general. He was the first one to understand in the present-day world that civilians were the backers up of things, and that if you went against civilians, you deprived the army of what kept it going. So he quite purposely made war against civilians, which was a kind of thing that would make Robert E. Lee turn over in his grave if he hears about it today. But he had the real notion. He saw from the very beginning how hard a war it was going to be. And when he said how hard a war it was going to be, he was retired under suspicion of insanity, and then brought back when they decided that maybe he wasn't so crazy after all. But Sherman saw from the start how tough it was going to be. Sherman had had many experiences in the South. As a young officer, he was stationed in Charleston. He liked it very much. At the time the war started, he was head of what is now LSU in Louisiana. And so he had great sympathy with a lot of Southern things. He'll make your hair stand on end his attitude toward the Negro and slavery question. He did not want to use black troops, and someone said he'll stop a bullet just as well as a white man. Sherman said, and a sandbag will do better than either. That's characteristic of Sherman too.
Let's talk about some battles now, and let's talk about one that's close to us here, Shiloh. Tell me about it. What should we need to remember about Shiloh?
The most important thing about Shiloh is it was the first big battle. It was the first great bloody battle. First Manassas, or Bull Run as it's sometimes called, was nothing compared to Shiloh. The thing about Shiloh to understand is that this mass of eventually 100,000 men were engaged in a great big armed fist fight. The generals didn't know their jobs, the soldiers didn't know their jobs. It was just pure determination to stand and fight and not retreat. And the bloodiness of it was just astounding to everyone. It also corrected a Southern misconception, which had said one good Southern soldier is worth 10 Yankee hirelings. He found out that wasn't true by a long shot. And Grant, shortly before Shiloh, said, I consider this war practically over. They're ready to give up. And the day after Shiloh, he said, I saw that it was going to have to be a war of conquest if we were to win. Shiloh did that. And it sobered the nation up something awful into the realization that they had a very bloody affair on their hands. And it called for a huge reassessment of what this thing was going to be.
What's a particularly dramatic moment in Shiloh? I think of Grant with his back to the...
Grant is wonderfully dramatic all the way through it. He had a badly sprained ankle, and he had to ride his horse with a crutch strapped to the saddle like a carbine, and he's all over the field. Sherman was wounded twice during the battle. To me, the most dramatic moment probably is the wounding and death of Albert Sidney Johnston in a charge on the peach orchard, which he led. He came out of it with bits of his clothing nicked all up. One boot sole was shot in half, and he flapped his on horseback there and said, they didn't trip me up that time. And very soon after that, they saw him reel in the saddle and realized he was hurt. And someone said, General, are you wounded? And he said, yes, and I fear seriously. And he was shot behind the knee in the femoral artery, I suppose, and bled to death. They saw blood coming out of his boot. And he could have been easily saved with a tourniquet, but he had sent his surgeon off to take care of some federal prisoners. And it was a needless loss.
throughout the war, I'm sort of going to digress for one moment, throughout the war, all these instances of the communication between troops and real camaraderie, one side to the other. What
Yep.
are your favorite stories in that?
Oh, Lord, there's so many of them. At Fredericksburg, there was an exchange across the Rappahannock. One of them hollered, "Hey, Reb." I said, "Yeah? When are you fellas going to come over?" I said, "When we get good and ready. What do you want?" He said, "Want Fredericksburg. Don't you wish you may get it?" And things like that. There were a lot of those exchanges. There were swapping. The Southerners had tobacco, and the Northerners had coffee, so they used to exchange those things during truces.
It's interesting. It's poignant.
It is indeed. The thing about the Civil War that strikes me as being most unusual is wars are savage affairs, and civil wars are the most savage affairs. The shooting of prisoners, for instance, is quite usual during a civil war. Lots of rapes and things like that during civil war. Practically none of either of those in our Civil War. In Sherman's march through Georgia, for instance, you would expect there'd be all kind of rapes and things. I know of no single case of rape during the whole march through Georgia. There must have been, but I've never heard of one.
Why did that happen?
It had something to do with the thing we were talking about earlier about the times. It was the simplicity and the geniality or something resembling that, and a notion of manners. That's hard to believe. Here you have the Confederate Army was perhaps at least 1/3 illiterate, and the Northern Army perhaps as many. And yet there was a kind of manners to people that I think had a lot to do with that. But when you contrast it with a modern civil war like the Spanish Civil War in the 30s, they shot prisoners regularly on both sides because the feelings were so intense in the Civil War. It's like two brothers fighting. You'll never see a more savage fight than two brothers can have. They pick up anything handy.
Well, speaking of savage, let me get back on track and ask you about Nathan Bedford Forrest.
Well, you're asking about the most man in the world in some ways. Forrest was a natural genius. Someone said that he was born to be a soldier the way John Keats was born to be a poet. He had some basic principles that, when you translate them, they fit right into the Army manual. When he said get there first with the most men, he's saying take the interior lines and bring superior force to bear. He had some very simple things. He used to say, hit them on the end, and he used to say, keep up the skier. And these are all good military principles expressed in Forrest's own way. And he was able to look at a piece of ground and see how to use it. He had a marvelous sense of typography. He could see the key to a position and know where to hit. He could also see what the other fellow was going to do and know how to counteract that action. He was only surprised in battle once. It was a place called Parker's Crossroads up in Tennessee. He was on a raid. And he was closing in on an opponent and fixing to finish him off when he was attacked in the rear by a force that he did not suspect was within many miles. And everybody was terribly upset. And he said, General, what shall we do? And he said, split in two and charge both ways. And did, and got out.
Didn't he have trouble keeping his horses?
He had 30 horses shot from under him in the course of the war, and he killed 31 men in hand-to-hand combat. And he said, I was a horse ahead at the end.
And what about the story of the man who shot him? Tell us to it.
That's a rather sad story. It was sad for Forrest. There was a young lieutenant on his staff. His name was Gould. And Forrest had reprimanded him for conduct in battle. And the man didn't take that very well. Nobody would in those days. And he resented it very much. And he brooded over it and came into Forrest's office where Forrest was sitting at a desk working on some papers. And the lieutenant came in and stood in front of the desk, and Forrest looked up and said, what do you want? And he said, I want you to know I resent your aspersions on me and Forrest said, I haven't got any time to truck with you. And it made the boy so mad that he pulled out a pistol and shot Forrest. And Forrest had on his desk a penknife, which he was turning while he talked. And he reached across, having been shot, and grabbed the young man and pulled him over the desk, and with the other hand opened the penknife with his teeth and carved him up with it, and then turned him loose. And the man staggered out, and he went across the street, as a matter of fact, into a store there, and they laid him out on a counter. And the doctor came to see Forrest and pronounced the wound mortal. They said, "General, you're going to die." And Forrest said, how is the lieutenant? And they said, "They've got him across the street over there. They think he'll be all right." And Forrest said, "By God, no man can kill me and live." Went out of the house and into the store across the street to finish him off. And they managed to keep him from getting hold of him, but the lieutenant died. And Forrest always regretted that happened that way. He was sorry for it afterwards. But in battle or in anger, Forrest would turn. One description of it, he looked like heated bronze. He was a very dangerous man to be close to in battle. He had a saber which, against all regulations, was sharpened like a razor. And he used to swing it all around his head while he was charging, and so that you had to be at least 5 feet from him, or you'd get cut yourself, no matter which side you were on. He's very nearly unbelievable. Forrest is. He's so great. He's wonderful.
Run out. No slate.
On the word great.
Great. Sound roll number 5, picture roll number 5, the Civil War, continuation of interview with Shelby Foote. I think a really important question, serious question, is when did the South lose the war? At what point? What was the turning point?
There never is really a turning point. You can't identify one, but if I had thumbscrews applied and had to name one, I think it would be Donaldson, that early in the war. Donaldson lost all of Kentucky, most of Tennessee. It saw the emergence of Grant and Forrest. It is when that northern juggernaut began to roll. And Shiloh was an attempt to stop it, a desperate attempt to stop it, and that failed. And from then on, the war in the West is a continuous advance. And it's my belief that the war in the West is at least as important as the one in the East. There's a general opinion, because of the amount of writing done on it and the amount of tourist visits, that the war was fought in Virginia while we were skirmishing out in this direction. I don't think that the opposite is true, but I think it's closer to the truth. And it's going to take study of the Western campaigns if you really want to understand the war. They should be studied and understood at least as much as the Eastern campaigns.
And the war was also fought far west. People don't realize that where was the war fought? In 10,000?
You had a 1,000-mile-long fighting line. It ran on across Missouri, for instance, and it skipped all the way out to what's now New Mexico. There was serious fighting out there in Valverde and those things out there. Incidentally, I hope you will have space for that New Mexico campaign. It's a miracle of a dramatic thing.
What are the other turning points?
They really are almost all turning points. These huge battles can't be anything but turning points. Certainly the loss of Vicksburg and the Mississippi River is one of them. Gettysburg is certainly another. Sharpsburg, for its own reasons, is a particular turning point because the British cabinet was in session and was about to recognize the Confederacy, some people think. And when they got the news that Lee had retreated from Maryland, they decided to wait longer to see what happened.
Do you know about Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain's maneuver on top of Little Round Top?
Yes, that's a very dramatic thing, and some people think because of what happened there, the Battle of Gettysburg was not lost. It's always dangerous to think what would have happened if someone hadn't done something. They simply would have done something else.
Just as if I didn't know, what did Chamberlain do?
He managed to get troops up there in time to stop the charge that the Alabamians and the Texans made against Little Round Top, and if they had taken Little Round Top, they could have gotten guns up there and dominated the whole northern line. And in fact, if they'd gotten guns up on Big Round Top, they could have done the same thing, and a whole brigade of Alabamians made it up on Big Round Top. But you're always wondering what might have happened if this hadn't happened, or what might have happened if this had happened, and the situation simply would have been changed. To speak really seriously about this thing, the question of whether the South could have won the war at any of these points, I do not think so. The only chance of the South winning that war would have been for England to come in on our side the way the French came in the Revolution, and they were never coming in. I think that the North fought that war with one hand behind its back. At the same time the war was going on, the Homestead Act was being passed. All these marvelous inventions were going on. In the spring of '64, the Harvard-Yale boat races were going on, and not a man in either crew ever volunteered for the Army or the Navy. They didn't need them. I think that if it had been more Southern successes, and a lot more, the North simply would have brought that other arm out from behind its back. I don't think the South ever had a chance to win that war.
Petersburg.
Petersburg is a magnificent salute to the durability of men on both sides. It was just it was a rehearsal for World War I, trench warfare, and they stood up very well to it. But the soldiers always did in that war. They were. It's to us an almost incredible bravery, considering the casualties. It's hard to understand. Those men seem larger than life in what they could endure, especially if you know anything about the medical attention they got. It was so crude, and the lack of anesthetics, all those things. It's just it's almost unbelievable that men could perform over a period of 4 years. Anybody can go out and perform some afternoon, but these men kept it up year after year.
The war was really visited on hundreds of thousands of anonymous people. What
Right.
of their record do you care about?
There's scarcely one of them that isn't interesting. If you can find a letter he wrote home or anything, they have this sympathy, and most of the letters say, "Please send me an old pair of pants," or anything. They don't talk about heroics. It's as if it was not something you talked about. You did it.
But their life was tough.
It was indeed tough. There are little things. They made these 25-mile marches. I've made 2 or 3 25-mile marches in the Army, and I was broken down for days after it. They made them, and I don't know whether you know it or not, when you were issued a pair of shoes in the Northern Army, they weren't left foot and right foot. They were the same shoe, and you wore them into being left foot and right foot. And when you imagine making 25-mile marches with inferior footwear, let alone barefoot the way many Confederates were, it's unbelievable the way they could function.
Didn't one side have a particular way of yelling?
They both had a particular way of yelling. The Northern troops made a sort of hurrah. It was called, one soldier, the deep, generous, manly shout of the Northern soldier. The Confederates, of course, had what was called the rebel yell. We don't really know what that sounded like. One Northerner described it. He said, he described it by describing the peculiar corkscrew sensation that goes up your backbone when you hear it. And he said, and if you've claimed you've heard it and weren't scared, that means you never heard it. It was basically, I think, a sort of fox hunt yip mixed up with a sort of banshee squall, and it was used on the attack. And an old Confederate veteran after the war was asked at a UDC meeting in Tennessee somewhere to give the rebel yell. The ladies had never heard it. And he said, it can't be done except at a run, and I couldn't do it anyhow with a mouth full of false teeth and a stomach full of food. So they never got to hear what it sounded like.
Speed and everything. Okay. That's me on. Okay, roll, buddy.
Wait.
Sharpsburg is the bloodiest day in American history. What are your feelings? Tell me about Sharpsburg.
Sharpsburg is an unusual battle in that there was no need for fighting it at all. Lee didn't have to fight it. But he was determined not to be run out, and he stopped to fight. A lot of people think that he was wrong to stop there and fight. But from then on, when Lee was on a retreat, anybody closing in on him was very, very cautious, probably because they remembered Sharpsburg.
It was a bloody day.
It was indeed a bloody day. It may not have been the bloodiest day of the war. It often is called that. I think perhaps the first day at Chickamauga was the bloodiest day, but we don't know because you can't separate the casualties the first and second day. It was a bloody one. It was unbelievable. Unbelievable. It was really 3 battles, one after another, left, center, and right. It's a highly dramatic action. If you wanted to see a battle that was highly dramatic, you'd probably take Sharpsburg or Fredericksburg, where you could see practically the whole field, and charge after charge.
Let me shift your gears, and if you could give us a little anecdote about Ben Butler.
Ben Butler is more amusing to look at than he is to read about. He was cockeyed, for one thing, and his arms and legs didn't seem to fit his body. What he mainly was a politician in uniform. He was no threat to anybody on the field fight, but he was a threat to Lincoln and to Grant. Grant had to be very cautious during that Petersburg campaign because Butler was next in rank, and if anything happened to Grant, it would have been Butler in command, and that was unthinkable. So Grant had to figure ways to get rid of him, and it was very hard to do because Lincoln could not afford to fire Butler on the eve of the election. Butler was a Democrat and controlled a lot of votes. He was a war Democrat, but he couldn't get rid of him. And then as soon as the election was over, Ben Butler was gone.
Tell me about Beauregard quickly.
Beauregard is a New Orleans Creole, flamboyant, given to magnificent dreams of conquest, all of which were beyond the capabilities of the South to perform. But I like Beauregard, and I think anyone who reads about him would like him. He's got a lot of color and dash to him. Those big, sad, bloodhound eyes of his and the love locks on his forehead. He's an extremely attractive figure.
What about the war on water, Farragut, and all that sort of stuff? We neglect that.
That's a whole other thing. That'll get us into the Anaconda Plan, which General Scott devised. He wanted to take the Mississippi River and blockade the coast and choke the South to death. And that's one of the things that did happen. The naval actions, I've written about many of them, and I find them absolutely unbelievable while I'm writing them. Here you have men with 8-inch guns firing at each other from a range of 8 feet. It's just unbelievable. It's so brutal. The Battle of Mobile Bay, for instance, you have one ironclad taking on the whole fleet simply because he would not surrender, until finally he did. But the naval stuff, as I say, it's hard to credit that men could do what they did on those boats. And approximately half the men in both navies couldn't swim, which is a strange thing. Not many people knew how to swim in those days. It's hard to think of a sailor not taking the trouble to learn how to swim.
That's no slate run out. Oh wait, we slated at the head, so we're fine. End of roll.
Yep.
Sound roll 6, camera roll 6, the Civil War, American documentaries, Florentine films, continuation with Shelby Foote. Yep. Okay. Who really won the war?
That's a very difficult question to answer. I can tell you who lost it. The South lost the war, but I'm not sure anybody won that war. It's a tragedy. The centennial was called a celebration. It should have been a time of mourning. If anybody won the war, it's people like Jay Gould and Jim Fisk, the robber barons late in the century. That war was defined once in an outrageous way by Alan Tate as an attempt on the part of the North to put the South into arrow collars, which is a joke. But there's some truth in it. The homogenization of our society, the really cruel follow-through of Reconstruction, which had its good and its bad sides. But after Reconstruction, it really became ugly in things like freight rate differentials and everything else. That war was won, and then the celebration of the winning of it went on for about 70 years. And I'm not sure how much benefit it was to the North, the winning of that war. The capitalism went spread eagle, and diversity went out of our life. I think that when the South was defeated to the extent that it was, the whole nation lost something when they lost that civilization, despite the enormous stain and sin of slavery. If that thing could have been done without a war, that is, slavery could have been abolished without a war, and I'm sure it could have, we wouldn't have lost so much with what we gained. I don't know of anything we gained that we couldn't have gained without a war. With certain exceptions, war always creates inventions. The fountain pen was invented during the Civil War. The machine for stitching the uppers to the soles of shoes was invented. In the North, as an example of how prosperous they were, any number of higher education institutions were established, MIT, Vassar, large numbers of things to show you how the North was living its own life while it was fighting that war. So that on the face of it, the North won the war, but the bill for winning it was huge in human values, not to mention human lives. So it's a difficult question to answer.
You want to stop? Yeah. Hold it. Wait. Rolling. Yep. What did Carlyle say about the
He described the Civil War, and this is a joke, it mustn't be held against him too much, as Thomas Carlyle, the English historian and essayist. He said that it was a contest between one group of people who preferred to hire their servants for life and another group of people who just wanted to hire them by the week. And he also said a thing that's funny. He said the American Civil War is like cleaning out a soot-filled chimney that is dirtying up the whole world. All that killing and interruptions of trade.
Could you very briefly take us on a quick trip through the Union generals?
Oh, Lord. A quick trip wouldn't be enough just to describe those in the Army of the Potomac, let alone out here. And I really don't think I could do that. It'd be too quick and be meaningless, I think.
Okay. Yeah. Tell me what happened to, very briefly, how did Lee end up?
He ended up in the noble way you might have expected after you'd learned to expect it. He didn't know what to do with himself after the war. His profession was gone. Even his country was gone. And he was approached with a good deal of hesitation by these people from a little school called Washington College. And he accepted the presidency of Washington College. He had an annual salary of $1,500 and a house to live in. And he spent the rest of his life at what after his death was called Washington Lee. And Lee at Washington College is something. There was a young man brought before him for some infraction of the rules. And can you imagine being brought before General Lee for having broken the rules? And the young man was trembling. And Lee said, "You need not be afraid. You'll get justice here." And the young man said, "I know it, General. That's what I'm scared of." But that's Lee for you. Yeah.
Nathan Bedford Forrest, what happened to him? What's his briefly?
Forrest died about 7 years after the war was over, probably of cancer of the stomach, but we don't know for sure. He died broke. He'd gone into the war worth $1 million, which was a great deal of money in those days. People who tell you Forrest was an illiterate somebody who came in out of the cotton fields don't know anything about Forrest. He was a member of the city council here in Memphis and all that. He was in railroad ventures. He tried farming on President's Island here, but none of it worked, and he did die broke.
Can we stop for a second? We've got it. Yeah, buddy. Head slate. But didn't Forrest start an organization of some repute, or isn't he?
Forrest was Imperial Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, we think, but that was started in Pulaski over in Middle Tennessee as a sort of social organization. Then it grew into be...
Excuse me, I gotta stop, please. Go ahead. Yeah, no. Tell me the story about Davis and the postage stamp, very quickly.
Davis was walking down the street in Richmond one day, and a Confederate soldier who was in Richmond on furlough passed him and stopped him and said, "Sir, mister, bean't you Jefferson Davis?" And Davis said that he was. He said, the soldier said, "Well, I thought so. You look so much like a Confederate postage stamp."
Didn't Vermont get invaded? What was it?
Yes, out of Canada, they descended on St. Albans one day, a small group of Confederates with civilian overcoats on over their uniforms, and they stripped the overcoats on and declared the town seized by the Confederacy and wanted all the money in all the banks to finance other adventures. It only lasted a couple of hours. But they brought with them things like glass containers of Greek fire for setting fire to the town if they had any trouble. And there was some shooting, too. The Vermonters didn't back down at all. They fired at them out of upstairs windows and everything. 2 or 3 men wounded was all it amounted to.
Did you have relatives who fought in the war?
My great-grandfather, Hezekiah William Foote, was at Shiloh. He got the tail shot off his horse there and his saber bent. And that was his only action. He retired immediately to Macon, Mississippi, and was in the Home Guard. He was a colonel there. He was 55 years old, though, so Shiloh was enough battle for him. It would have been enough for me, too. Yeah.
Can you explain the names, how the Confederates and the Yankees call things by different names? If you could just
You mean the battles?
The battle.
The tendency was for northern armies officially to call after the nearest stream of water, Antietam Creek, for instance, and the Confederates tend to name them after towns, Sharpsburg in that case. Same way with Murfreesboro and Stones River. I've often thought that that's because towns were unusual to Southerners who lived rurally, and so they named them after the nearest town.
Is there something that we should ask? I mean, we're really struggling to come to grips with the real question of what this war meant to all of us and at the time. How can we understand the war?
You have to understand, first, its importance as to why you should understand. Any understanding of this nation has to be based, and I mean really based, on an understanding of the Civil War. I believe that firmly. It defined us. The Revolution did what it did. Our involvement in European wars, beginning with the First World War, did what it did. But the Civil War defined us as what we are, and it opened us to being what we became, good and bad things. And it is very necessary, if you're going to understand the American character in the 20th century, to learn about this enormous catastrophe of the mid-19th century. It was the crossroads of our being, and it was a hell of a crossroads. The suffering, the enormous tragedy of the whole thing.
Let me end with my first question. Why did the Civil War happen? Why did Americans kill Americans in such extraordinary numbers?
It happened because the tactics were behind the weapons. They had weapons in their hands that were capable of doing a great deal more killing than those tactics had been designed to take care of. And there's something about tenacity of the American soldier that caused a lot of them to die. Obviously, you wouldn't have nearly as many killed if a lot more had run away. So that those two factors, I think, account for the large numbers of dead, along with a generous sprinkling of stupidity on both sides. People did things they just should not have done and got a lot of people killed doing it. The most startling example of that is Hood's attack at Franklin, Tennessee. That kind of thing has to be a scientist's job. He just attacked a thoroughly entrenched army as a way of disciplining his own army, and he damn near got it destroyed. The charge at Franklin is a more tragic thing than the charge at Gettysburg, if you get to looking at it. It was more difficult to do, and the casualties even were high. It was an incredible blunder, and that you have to assign its share in the huge amount of bloodshed.
Cold Harbor.
Cold Harbor, very much the same kind of thing. When that Confederate Army went into position at Cold Harbor, those were men who knew how to take a position where you could do the most killing from. And that whole army was lined up there waiting and hoping and praying something would come at them. And Grant threw 3 corps at them. And in approximately 7 minutes, they killed about 7,000 men, or shot about 7,000 men down. It was a bloody mess. It's the only thing Grant ever admitted that he'd done wrong. He said after the war, if I had to do over again, I don't believe I'd make that charge at Cold Harbor. He never admitted about anything else. It was not Grant's way to admit any blame. And that had his good side. He didn't worry about faults that he had made, and he just went ahead, always.
Thank you, Shelby Foote.
The airplane certainly did cooperate with that, didn't he?
Yeah.